right. Hi, everyone. This is Kerim Baran with Solar Academy. I am here today with Allie Detrio. Allie is the founder, CEO of Reimagine Power. Reimagine Power is a policy intelligence, market strategy, and advocacy company for anything renewable with special focus on microgrids and advanced energy technologies, mostly on the West Coast, but obviously they're knowledgeable about most everything that's happening in the US. And today, we'll talk a little bit about, Ali, I want to start always with a little bit of your background, how you found yourself doing what you're doing. I know a little bit of your personal story, so I would like you to share that again if you can. And then let's dive into one big beautiful bill and its implications for our beautiful situation that we're in
Yeah,
right now.
absolutely. Well,
Yeah,
Karen, thanks so much for having me
yeah.
on the show. And thanks everybody for tuning in today. So, as Karen said, I'm Allie Detrio, I'm the Chief Strategist for Reimagine Power. We focus on microgrids and distributed energy resources, policy, intelligence, advocacy, and market strategy. Our main states that we focus on are in the Western states, so California, Hawaii, Oregon, Colorado. But we do keep our finger on the pulse in all the different states, as well as at the federal level, which we're going to talk about today. Really excited about some of the work we've been doing recently. We helped pass two really important microgrid bills in Oregon that are going to help pave the way to create a regulatory framework to unlock more of the opportunities for microgrids in that state. We're continuing to push forward in California, the fourth largest economy in the world, to make sure that we do have robust market pathways for solar storage, microgrids, and other clean energy technologies. And I think that state's going to be really critical in terms of leadership here when it comes to some of the federal implications of the OBBB that we're going to talk about. And really, I got my start in this industry back when I was in college, had my degree from Arizona State University. I was part of the first undergraduate class in the world to get a sustainability degree back when no one really knew what that was. And what I always found cool and what resonated with me was that, sustainability is really about the intersection of the environment, the economy, and society. So that was really compelling to get me into sustainability. And from there, what do people need more than anything else in this world? Water and power. So my experience is really rooted in the water and power sector, but I've spent probably the last 17 years mostly focused on the clean energy sector. And again, doing a lot of work in government regulatory affairs, but also bridging the gap between policy and project development, business and market strategy, and helping our clients and partners really navigate through these ever-changing policies and regulations so that they can position themselves well in the market. And as we're going through the solar coaster, continue to thrive and succeed so that we can meet all of our really ambitious climate and clean energy goals. And so, yeah, really excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Kerim.
Thanks, Ali. Thank you for sharing all that. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the OBB and what changes. And maybe first focus on residential solar, and then we can go up to scale, CNI, utility, what changes are coming and when, based on all the new changes that
Yeah,
passed.
absolutely. So maybe I'll just start with just a quick high level for those
Yeah.
that need a little baseline. So on July 4th of this year, President Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was HR 1, which is really a sweeping budget and tax package that has major consequences for clean energy development across the United States. The
Hmm.
legislation narrowly passed the Senate, nearly along party lines. The vote was 218 to 214. And the bill is really going to significantly roll back energy tax credits, as well as rescind funding for key clean energy programs, as well as impose stricter manufacturing and sourcing and procurement requirements for renewable energy projects and equipment. And there's a lot of projections out there, varying different sources saying that this is really going to raise electricity rates for customers dramatically depending on what state you're in. Some states like California already have really high electricity rates. Others that have lower rates might see sharper rises in rates over the next few years. Those are some of the kind of the key projections we're seeing coming out of this. Though, all remains to be seen over, the course of the next 6 months and a couple of years. Um, but so yeah, let's start with the impacts on the renewable energy tax credits. I think that's the biggest one
Yeah.
that we want to focus on today. So the 30% investment tax credit, the ITC. That's one that most of you guys are utilizing to help monetize your projects and help bring down the cost of projects so we can really scale and build out the market here in the United States. So those have been really sharply reduced. So right now, projects to keep the ITC that was in place before the bill passed, they have to start service by late 2027 or begin construction within 1 year of the bill adoption. So that really accelerates a lot of the project development timelines and is a really tough requirement for a lot of projects, I'd say, that are larger than the residential scale, because it is really hard to go through that whole design, implementation, and construction phase. So putting those deadlines in place for the clean energy sector, for wind and solar specifically, is going to be really tough for a lot of projects. However, we are at a point where there is now a deadline for beginning service or beginning construction. So we may actually see a little bit of an uptick in solar production and projects coming online while we go through 2025 through 2027, because that creates a sense of urgency for customers to start adopting these projects and really get going on the development timelines that can really range depending on the size and scale of the projects. And so really we're looking at eliminating a lot of the credits for everything from solar water heating, solar and wind, and anything that relates to solar and wind capacity. There are other sectors of the energy industry that are not being harmed quite as much by the ITC changes, such as those like geothermal, bioenergy, hydrogen. Some of those are not going to be impacted as greatly as solar and wind. So I'd say overall, the impacts of the bill are felt most significantly by the solar and wind industry.
Okay, can I just pause you for a second and go back a little and double click? So if we are talking about ITC going away, as long as you start a project within the next pretty much 12 months, you capture the ITC, or if you finish the project within a year and a half from now, by the end of 2027, you capture the project. And this applies across the board to residential, commercial, industrial, and utility scale solar projects, I would think. Is that a correct statement?
I say mostly correct. So I'll differentiate a little bit here with
Yeah.
like the homeowner, the residential ITC that
That
expires at the end of 2025. So residential
Okay,
leasing
yes,
and
that's what I
PPA.
thought. So
Yeah, but
as long as there's a leasing company involved, then the ITC stays for another year and a half, pretty much,
right.
for homes.
And
Um,
and when
uh,
they say start service and begin construction, like we're basically talking
yeah,
about making sure that you are putting your project you're starting construction within a year of the bill adoption. So
yeah,
basically by summer of next year, need to begin
yeah,
construction and being in service by late 2027. So
right.
there's kind of two
But
deadlines
how
there.
about homes? We said the deadline is the end of this year for individual. Usually these are, and I think Trump's logic there was that only the wealthy homes are able to self-finance these anyway.
Right.
So let's take that advantage away from the wealthy. Was kind of like he positioned it, and so what
Mhm.
is the rule there? Is it like, does it have to be finished by the end of this year, or does it have to have started by the end of this year for those
It,
residential projects?
It's
Just
my
curious.
understanding that has to be started.
By the end of this.
And that's when the expiration goes away.
Got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
but so
Yeah.
non-residential projects that start construction less than 12 months and are placed into service within 4 years can claim the full ITC or PTC.
Got it.
So
One more question on that
yeah,
before we go into the PTC and the ITC stuff. Um, the However, having said all this about solar, great, understood. But then there is a extension, or actually ITC doesn't go away for battery projects all the way to 2030, maybe even beyond that. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then what makes a project, if it's a solar project that I am doing, let's say a wealthy individual is doing it at their home that has a battery and solar, what does that qualify as? And then if there is a, leased project with batteries or commercial industrial finance, unfinanced projects with batteries, how does the math work out for those?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of the math, it's a little difficult to say like how in terms of the value stacking of incentives, how they're going to treat like solar plus storage combines. The storage ITC, as you mentioned, that's exempted from the accelerated phase down, and that's supposed to be intact through 2023 is or 2033 is our
33, yep,
read.
yep, yep.
Yeah. However, the solar, there is an excise tax on solar projects that are using um, any sort of other foreign entity of concern requirements. And so there really, I think it's going to come down to um, where are you sourcing some of your technologies from, like, or the companies that are using that. So it's a little unclear, I would say, with some of the projects on the residential side, whether or not they're gonna be able to still meet like the with between the ITC just straight up the blanket, you have to really have everything in service by 2027, and that ITC expires at the end of the year. The storage component, it's unclear to me right now whether you're still exempt from the phase down or not. So they might be treating those two things differently. So I think individual companies are going to have to look at how are like, and this is where it comes down to the companies are going, if you're whether you're doing a residential or commercial project, you're really going to need to look at where are you doing solar plus storage? Is your project considered commercial or is it considered residential? And where are the materials and like equipment being sourced from to really determine that full value stack? So I will say a lot of it, this is still very convoluted. We may even see at some point, some more clarifying, sections of code be added over the next 6 months as we get closer to the end of the year in 2026 or the end of 2025 and moving into 2026. Because there is, so I'd say, a lot of murkiness here when you are looking combining technologies like solar and storage. So the storage ITC is still exempt from the phase down and it's intact. The solar specific is expiring, but the ITC can still be received by the residential leasing companies. So so depending on
For
who
another
you're,
year and a half, for another year and
yeah,
a half. Yeah.
yeah, I would say
For the
right now,
solar component. But for the battery component, both the individual homeowners and leasing companies can, or financing entities can take the ITC on the battery for until 2020, 2033. And
that's my understanding. Yeah,
yeah, got it. And then, of course, then will be the question of, okay, you did a $30,000 project for your home. How much of that is solar value, and how much of that is storage value, and how much of the
right.
labor, blah blah. Like there will have to be some clarification around that, obviously. And hey, if you can still get a significant portion of that ITC, that's another year or two less in payback time. So that is not that bad if that's allowed, and
Right.
should be.
Exactly. So I think
Yeah,
one of the big key things is really to really understand like what your project looks like from a financing perspective with the company that you might be working for, and looking at your timeline for development and construction. So I'd say those are the
yeah.
most critical elements of the legislation that are really key to working with your provider on to make sure that you are getting the maximum value for your investment.
And
And
can you, before you go, I know you have a lot to
Mhm.
share. Can you also, for viewers' benefit, clarify the difference between ITC and PTC? Um, uh,
Sure. So there's the investment tax credit,
which
which
is the 30% we've been
which
getting off the total project value,
right,
usually, right?
exactly. So
Yep.
the production tax credit is slightly different where it's based on the like usually tax credits that when you're taking the PTC, that's based on most facilities that are not solar and wind are using the production tax credit, and
Hmm.
that's got that's different in that it eliminates certain credits that you would otherwise be getting with the ITC, and it provides additional methods of measuring like additions of capacity. So when we say like production tax credit, it's related to like electricity production. And so there are a
So,
number of
so then you're not taxed on the revenues going forward of that project. Is that
correct.
got it?
That's my understanding of it. So you're not getting the production tax credit applies to when you're talking about like the actual generation of capacity, and yes, whatever monetization pathway you might be taking for that. Most
Got
of the
it.
time, you have to choose one or the other. So most solar and wind projects take the ITC, and a lot of other projects such as like bioenergy, like nuclear or geothermal, they're usually taking the production tax credit because they're adding more, we call it firm capacity to the grid.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Great. Unless you have more to share on this topic, I would like to jump into a little bit about like, so, okay, this has happened federally, but there are things that
Legislation in
the,
general is the differences between some of the implications for solar and wind compared to compared to some of the other technologies. So like clean hydrogen, zero emission nuclear power, bioenergy that does not produce emissions, such as like more of like the advanced like biomass gasification and pyrolysis. Those do not have the same implications and the same hits to the, I'd say, the tax credit overall that solar and wind do. So if you're looking at projects that are like incorporating multiple resources, such like as in a microgrid, this becomes a little bit more complex because there are different rules. It's kind of technology specific. And that's, I think it's a not a unique thing, but something that's generally in public policy. You try to design policies and regulations based on performance and outcomes, not technology specific requirements. And so this is where the ITC and the PTC, again, very critical depending on what type of project you're developing, whether it's residential, non-residential, and which types of resources you're using, as well as again the sourcing requirements of where this equipment and materials come from. That it's really important to work with your provider and their teams to understand where you can monetize certain components of your project, because there are differences between those technologies. And that's something that generally at the state level anyway, we try to incentivize or write policies and regulations for outcomes, not necessarily for technology specific issues. Because this is what one of the things I think is really uncertain right now is when you're looking at value stacking your projects, and some of these things that I'd say are unclear and may get more legal and regulatory clarity in the months and I'd say a year ahead. It is quite difficult to really look at this holistically when you do have multiple different resources.
got it. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're observing and also making happen and influencing on the western side of the country in terms of policy that still advances the cause despite all of this, you know, new act?
Yeah, I definitely can talk more about some of the state implications. So, between the
Yeah,
ITC as well as some of the rescinding of the Inflation Reduction Act funding, a lot of these Department of Energy grants that were going to the states, we're now seeing a really big shift where there's a lot of uncertainty in the market, with looking at some of these state programs that had that had either set up programs or even set up whole agencies to receive the federal funding that came out of the Inflation Reduction Act. So, for example, like in California, we are looking at more like a $20 billion loss from our greenhouse gas reduction fund, which was supposed to get some of that match from the federal government. And I'd say Oregon, same thing. We're looking at, anticipating no money coming from the federal government when it comes to looking at our community renewable energy programs or the community energy resilience programs. So the impacts on some of these federal these federal grants, these federal loan programs as well. Now that we're not getting that federal funding, the states are really scrambling to see how they can either still keep these programs moving forward at the state level, or how they might have to adjust their own state budgets in order to still keep them going. And we're really looking at, I'd say, California, our biggest market here, we're looking at a really large budget shortfall. And unlike the federal government, which can run a deficit of its budget because it has the ability to, essentially hold debt and like service its own debt, states have to have balanced budgets at the state level. So they can't run deficits like the federal government. So that's really sent the industry, and I'd say the states, into a scramble to figure out how to rebalance their budgets now that they're not receiving a lot of the federal dollars that they were anticipating, or that had come into the bank and that were going to be promised, for years to come under the IRA. So that's one of the biggest things we're seeing, is a lot of different programs or investments that states were going to be making, anticipating federal funding would help with matching that. Now we're seeing a scramble to figure out whether a lot of those projects can still move forward, or those programs can still move forward. And if not in the same manner, can we, like, what are the states doing to try and like bridge those gaps?
Yeah,
And
one one one
every
such
state's a little
program.
different too when it comes to how they collect like tax revenue, for example. So in certain states like Oregon, they don't have sales tax revenue. So they're relying on, property taxes, they're relying on their general fund sources of revenue. A state like California has both sales tax and property taxes. So there's also like a really huge difference with between the states in terms of how they're looking to balance their budgets depending on their own state sources of tax revenue, as well as things from the federal government.
One such program that is important to our audience, obviously, is the SGIP program, which is for the batteries, and that's been fueling a lot of batteries to be coupled with solar systems over the past years in California. And are there other states that have created similar programs on the west side or the rest of the country? And what do you think is the fate of such programs going forward? And related to that, some folks that I've talked to, and my view on all this is like, okay, this is some pullback, but it's not the end of the world. And we still have ITC for storage, which is really the important part for the next 10 years, is really growing storage for solar, because solar with storage is super powerful. And but then the comeback I hear is like, yes, but President Trump can make these a lot worse with his executive orders, so he can chip at it in different ways. But so my question is, what can states do back in return to still advance the clean energy cause?
I think that's a really great question. So, like, focusing specifically on storage, since the storage ITC is right now surviving through 2033, that's preserving one of the most valuable growth areas for distributed energy resources and microgrids and other like clean energy technologies that we're looking at continuing to advance. So, while solar as a generating asset is really taking a hit, the fact that storage is remaining eligible, I think that's one really critical, that's one really critical win, where this credit survival is really significant for continuing to grow our markets despite the hit to, I'd say, the solar generation part of our business. And storage, especially when we're looking at California, you mentioned SGIP, the Self Generation Incentive Program. We have that funding nearly exhausted, and it was spent so much faster than we ever could have imagined. I was actually part of the group that passed SB 700 back in 2018 with Senator Scott Wiener to create under $800 million in energy storage incentives, which really spurred a ton of market growth and transformation. And then the state actually did allocate more of its general fund in a previous budget cycle to continue to make that storage program financially viable and extend the program because it was considered to be so successful. We're now at a point where a lot of that funding is exhausted. And so I think there's, again, a lot of uncertainty at the state level with programs like SGIP, looking in, places like Oregon, their community renewable program, and others, where we are going to have to look at how the states can, I think, really help to preserve the storage market, and looking at how like storage being key to grid reliability, renewables integration, and like grid modernization, that's really going to be critical. So I think one of the silver linings is that storage is got such an incredible value to our grid, to customers when it comes to resiliency, to helping to balance things for renewables integration. That is something that the states can really do, is really look at storage as an area where if you're going to look at having limited general fund dollars, limited tax revenue coming in, and you don't have that federal match in the same manner that you used to, really focusing on keeping the storage market strong at the state level is going to be key. um, and I think also as well, maybe that translates also into some of the manufacturing tax credits with that have this like stackability. This could really stimulate some more domestic manufacturing growth, especially in like solar and batteries. There's in the West, I'd say, a potential for a lot of regional manufacturing hubs to emerge or reemerge. But that will really depend on the build out speed and whether this kind of offsets some of these looming sourcing restrictions. So another opportunity here, I think, is to really look at how do we invest more local resources, local manufacturing, local production in states, and especially ones that are really like on the forefront of the industry transformation that we're seeing. So like Colorado, like Oregon, California, etc. And I guess one other thing I'll add on that, like the bill, some of the things that I think are you could look at in a positive light. This is going to push the renewable energy industry to really wean themselves away from grants and incentives and tax credits and focus on the stacking of benefits that are actually delivered. So, such as, like, again, looking at grid reliability, community resilience, providing capacity when we need it, and stabilizing costs for customers. So, even hedging against rising energy costs from like your traditional utility service. So while this is really, I think, a setback for the industry right now, it could actually help propel us forward to kind of looking at a more sustainable long-term business model that's based on monetization and compensation for services and benefits that are provided to the grid. Again, the grid, such as, again, reliability or grid support services. Another thing is as well, the fossil fuel industry has been, some of the winners of this legislation. There's such long lead times for large developments like that type of technology. A lot of like new manufacturing, heavy industry. Fossil fuel technology still has a really, really long lead time for equipment sourcing, for project development. And so some of the major industries that we're seeing looking into things like microgrids, solar and batteries, like data centers, like manufacturing, like hospitals, a lot of those high energy intensive industries and customer segments, they are really looking at how do we get power for our new facilities ASAP. And the fossil fuel industry is just not going to be able to deliver on
I
meeting that kind of customer demand. And so
totally agree.
I think that there's also, and as well, when we look at, NERC and several, in the state agencies, many of them are projecting that we're going to see, significant, constraints when it comes to our power capacity. Our grid reliability is under threat with all the different impacts of climate change and extreme weather. And so resources like microgrids and on-site energy systems like solar and storage as an alternative to the traditional energy services or utility and oil and gas type of service. We're going to see microgrids and solar and storage as on-site systems, I think, continue to grow, both as, again, mitigating the risk of like cost, utility cost rising, but also to really power the demand for those facilities that are coming regardless of what happens with the tax credit. So while the the monetization value or like the cost might not be as rich as it once was, there's still so much value there. And I think as well, the industry's done a really good job of educating these various customer segments about the benefits of microgrids and on-site solar and storage and seeing all that they can do. So what we've also gotten customer segments way more educated and interested in these technologies. And so while the value is not the same when you do have something like the ITC, or you don't have the same like ability to go after grants and incentives, that value stack of benefits is starting to become much more significant for these types of customers. And just having that awareness, I think, is going to drive more customer demand compared to what we've seen, like, let's say, the past 10 years. And that's really driven by, cost reliability for the grid, resilience. And a lot of these companies and businesses have really aggressive decarbonization sustainability goals of their own. And so there's still going to be a demand for clean energy technologies, despite some of the hits that we're seeing the industry with the passage of this bill.
Right, right. Thank you for sharing all this, Ali. What a wealth of information. Thanks. Thank you. Um, As we near the end of the conversation, I would like to ask you one more thing. So, what fuels your fire? What are you wanting to fight now that this is past? We have a new reality, but what is worth fighting for, and what are some of the things that you see in your world with your clients, customers, and stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question, Karen. Thank you. I would say this, while, the federal government and like again, the ITC and some of the implications of this bill are going to be felt across the industry. Most of the most of the energy policy issues happen at the state level. So I really
Mhm.
see a lot of states like Oregon, for example, that just passed this landmark microgrid legislation. Colorado, for example, passing a roadmap to try and get more development of microgrids and advanced renewables on their system. California, continuing to be a market leader and try to continue to be like really push forward in advancing the climate change agenda. I think that we're going to see a lot more activity at the state level, and that's really where we see a lot of the real implications for project development and really market transformation is at the state level. So utility tariffs, some of these like incentives and regulations that happen at the state level, and again, when we look at like regional grid impacts, regional climate change impacts, this incentives and tax credits are really not the only thing that drive the business case for on-site energy.
Yeah.
And we're seeing energy costs just continue to rise across the board. And so I'm looking at a lot of really exciting like activities happening in the states where we are going to see, I think, states really try to step up and showcase their leadership on these fronts, especially ones in the West, despite some of the federal implications here. So the bills in Oregon are some of my most exciting. Like I'm really excited about the opportunity to do more business in Oregon, where traditionally they've had lower power prices because of having a lot of hydropower, but they've had, basically a 48% increase in electric rates in 4 years. That trend is projected to continue to rise. And so that's going to drive a lot more demand for solar and batteries and microgrids. I think a lot of other states that maybe were a lot more moderate, such as Colorado, but still looking at decarbonization, looking at how to become more resilient with, between winter storms, wildfires, extreme heat. We're going to see a lot more activity at the state level. And some of those states that maybe were more moderate are starting to see some of those impacts in the way that California, for example, has been feeling for a long time with like our wildfires, extreme heat, etc. And so some of these states that we really haven't seen as much activity from in the past are going to start really amping up their leadership when it comes to policy and regulations at the state level. And some of the utilities in across the country between the East Coast, like Massachusetts, New York, Florida, and then again across the West and the Midwest, everyone is going to start seeing their rates go up because of the drive for new electricity demand through electrification, electric vehicles, looking at hot water heaters, all these different technologies are coming out for electrification purposes. A lot of the states are going to start seeing more demand for those technologies, even though, again, we have some of this federal implications. I think they're going to really start to step up more and help try to service that demand. And we're going to see a lot more work at the state level. And while that might not look like incentives, there are ways, again, when we're talking about monetizing projects, like providing compensation for services. I mentioned that like value stack of services that these technologies can provide. I could see a lot of states really looking at how do we design rates and tariffs at the utility sector that help meet the demand for these new resources, like again, in data centers, new manufacturing, et cetera, that may be driven in some part by some of the other implications of the bill, like, domestic manufacturing. We're going to see a lot more, I think, utility rates and tariffs that are looking to get creative with monetizing and providing compensation for services. So, like grid reliability, grid support, because the investor in utilities, the macro grid cannot handle that kind of really high influx of new demand from something like a data center, a new manufacturing facility. And, doing the macro grid upgrades take, again, years to develop, to make those kinds of upgrades. There's long lead times there. So I think that's where there's a really strong business case for on-site energy. And then when you look at, again, like power outages, all these like regional climate impacts, the states that are really feeling those different impacts, I think are going to look at ways in which they can get creative and, again, showcase their leadership on the various fronts. So that's what's most exciting to me is I think we're going to see some markets like those, again, that haven't been traditional like climate and clean energy leaders really step up, but it might not be driven necessarily by climate. It might be driven by the need to really look at, improving grid reliability in those regions, reducing power outages in certain areas, and servicing their own regional economic growth and economic development that's happening. So that's really exciting to me to see. Like, I'm really interested to see what states start to become more leaders in the clean energy sector here, especially when it comes to on-site power. Now that we've had some of this legislation come forward that is driving a lot of changes both in the energy sector, but in our more macroeconomic impacts broadly. So it'll be interesting to see. I couldn't place bets on which ones I think are going to really rise to the top of market leaders. I don't like picking winners and losers, but I would definitely look at places like the Midwest, some of those like, Mountain West regions, and others that are impacted in the coasts to see like what they do next.
All right. Allie Detrio of Reimagine Power, thank you so much for sharing all this information with us.